Hi, it's Amy Sandler, and we're thrilled to share a conversation that Kim had with Jeff Wetzler. Jeff's the author of Ask, Tap into the Hidden Wisdom of People Around You for Unexpected Breakthroughs in Leadership and Life. This one was recorded live, so you'll hear Kim and Jeff reflect on some questions from the audience as well. I love questions, so this one's a favorite for me. And in fact, asking questions is the foundational skill of practicing radical candor. In other words, soliciting feedback. Also, if you're looking for a little Easter egg in this conversation, Kim shares a story when she refers to a colleague of hers who gave her some feedback. Spoiler alert, that colleague was me. If you like these live conversations, you can find them with accompanying videos on our YouTube channel under the Live tab. You can listen to the podcast on YouTube as well.
I am excited to introduce Jeff Wetzler, who is the author of a wonderful book and a book I love and a book that is very important. If you are trying to create a culture of radical candor, you need to learn how to ask for feedback and for just to ask in general. So, Jeff, talk a little bit more about your book, Ask, and then I'll ask you some questions and you can ask me some questions.
Love it. Thank you for having me, Kim. It's great to be with you. The premise of the book, Ask, is that the people around us in our lives, whether that's our coworkers, our managers, the people we manage, clients, investors, friends, whoever it is, they are filled with ideas and insights and perspectives, even feedback for us that is not always coming to us directly. They are not necessarily exhibiting candor in how they treat us. But if we could actually tap into what they knew, we would be better off together. We would make better decisions together. We would save a lot of time together. We would have closer relationships. We would even probably innovate better because new ideas would pop out of that. But just too often it doesn't. And so the starting point of the book is what's going on here? What are the biggest things that people are not telling us? I bring out research around what are the top things that stay stuck in people's heads and why. And then the book says, what can we do about that? And that's really the heart of the book, which is something called the Ask approach, which is 5 practices that truly help us tap into what those around us think, feel, and know so that we can get better results, better relationships, better learning.
I love that. I mean, I think one of the superpowers that people most often long for is the desire to be able to read other people's minds. And your book gives them that superpower.
What's so interesting is that the book starts by citing a Gallup poll asking Americans, what do they wish was their top superpower? And the two top ones were time travel and the ability to read other people's minds. But
absolutely.
We are so bad at it. And it turns out that all the conventional suggestions for how to do that, like read their body language, put yourself in their shoes, none of it works. There's literally only one thing that research shows works to read other people's minds, which is to ask them.
Yes. Yeah. And listen to what they say, not imagine. It's so interesting. There's a lot of research coming out of University of Chicago and probably other places as well that shows that we misinterpret each other's facial expressions, and there's more noise than signal there. But we imagine that we know what we know that we don't know what other people think, and yet then we imagine we do know at the same time.
And those facial expressions and what we read in them aren't totally useless. Those can be cues for us to get curious about what may be going on. Cues for us to actually ask. So they have value. It's just that we can't just assume that how we read them is what's truly going on for someone. Because it's usually not.
Yeah, and I think that's. I got some feedback from someone I work with at Radical Candor recently, where I was making that mistake. I was looking at their facial expression, and I said, "It looks like you disagree." And she said, "No, I don't disagree." And she explained to me and then I did it again. And I realized rather than making an assertion, it looks like you disagree, I should say, what are you thinking?
Yes. What's your reaction to what I just said?
Yeah.
And what was so interesting about that example is, you did at least one step better than what many of us do, which is by saying it looks like you disagree. You gave her the chance to at least correct you. Many of us just say, look, in our heads, it looks like they disagree. Let me double down on my argument to convince them, or those kinds of things without even naming what we're seeing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so one of the things that we were chatting about before is what happens when we don't ask.
Yes.
Very often it's like some form of ruinous empathy. So talk what I call ruinous empathy anyway. So
Yes.
talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So in my research for the book, I really dug into this question of why is it that people don't tell us what they really think, feel, and know, especially if it would help us both. And I'll tell you, as an operating leader, I have had many situations where I have learned something way too late,
Mm-hmm.
near catastrophe, and
Mm-hmm.
my team knew it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had even been saying to them, how's it going? How can I help? And I was getting back like, yeah, pretty good. A few bumps, but we got it covered.
Yeah.
And and they could have told me. And I'm thinking to myself, why did they not tell me? And so
Yeah.
that, in many ways, was the curiosity on my part that is animating a lot of this book. And several big reasons kind of came out. One of the big reasons, and the top reason is fear of the impact of what of
Yeah.
what they
Fear of
might say.
retribution.
Fear that it could piss me off. It could
Yeah.
make me get back at them. It could make them look stupid. It could put tension
Yeah.
into our relationship. Like any dimension of the fear of the impact is a
Yeah.
huge piece of this. As one interesting example of that in research for the book, I came across this study that showed that between 60 and 80% of Americans, depending on the demographics, withhold things about their own health from their doctor. They literally don't tell their own doctor something important about their own health. And so the
Yeah.
doctor's not finding out. And when they
Yeah.
asked the Americans, why are you not telling this to your doctor? It was, I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't
Yeah.
want to burden them. I don't want to waste their time. All of this is the fear. So that's one really
Yeah.
important one. A second one that came out is that people just don't have the words. They
Mm-hmm.
may want to say it, but they don't know how to take what they may be feeling in their body or in their gut and
Mm-hmm.
actually put it into words. And sometimes it's a math problem, which was really interesting because there was this neuroscience study that
Mm-hmm.
showed that people can think at 900 words per minute, but the mouth can only get out 125 words per minute. And so that means
That's
that
frustrating.
it's frustrating. And anytime I'm talking to someone, I'm hearing less than 15% of what they're really thinking, not because they're holding back on purpose. The math just doesn't work to get it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so that's been really interesting too. And then one other one that I think is quite actionable is that people don't tell us what they really think because they don't realize we want to know.
Yeah.
They don't think we care, and if they don't think we care, like why bother? We're busy and all those kinds of things. So it's
Yeah.
almost like overdetermined that people are not going to tell us these things that they're
Yeah.
going to treat us, with ruinous empathy. And
Yeah.
I'm curious about this question of how are we complicit in that? Like if I'm not getting this from my team or from someone around me or my investor or my board member, what's my own complicitness? How am I contributing to the ruinous empathy? I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you're not asking for that. I mean,
Yeah.
I always joke, nobody in your life wants to give you feedback unless you have teenage children. They really want to give you feedback.
Yes, you do. And I have two teenagers.
Yeah, me too. I'm getting a lot of it in my house, but I love it,
Yeah.
And in fact, I asked them for more,
Yeah.
thanks to your book. Why don't we ask? I think that's the question, because we do think we want to know, but we don't ask. And I think part of it is just that it is awkward. There's like a social awkwardness. So let's imagine that you want me to give you an orange, and I am not intending to give you an orange. But I don't want to tell you that because it feels kind of mean. And you don't want to ask me, Kim, will you commit to giving me an orange by June 1st? Because if you asked it to me just that bluntly, then I would say no. I'm not going to have an orange to give you on June 1st. But but you don't want to, I don't want to disappoint you. You don't want to put me in an awkward situation. And so we both leave that conversation thinking what we want to think and not what's really going to happen. So you think you're going to get the orange, and I think I'm not going to give you the orange. And I think you know that. And so being willing to ask that commitment conversation, Kim, can you commit to giving me an orange on June 1st, is how you're going to get the answer when you still have time to do something about the fact that I'm not going to deliver you this orange.
Yes. And now let's substitute the orange for, are you going to give me a promotion?
Yes.
Or are you going to give me a raise?
Yeah.
Or different things like that.
Yeah.
Or are you going to give me a positive review?
Yeah. Or are you going to deliver that report on time? I mean,
Yes.
I found this as a manager all the time. I would say, oh, we need this, such and such. And my people working for me would say, yeah, we need it, but they didn't say, yes, I'm going to deliver it to you. But I
Yes.
heard, so I had to learn that was my fault as the leader. I had to ask for that commitment. Do
Yes.
you commit to getting me this report by June 1st?
And the
And then I would
ambiguity,
learn. Yeah.
right. When we don't do that, we leave that ambiguity. It can even just sound like, hey, yeah, we really should get back to that client by Tuesday. But that no one's saying, and I'll do it. And I'll,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of the, so, I totally agree. I think that's one reason why we don't ask. And there's some really interesting research that people over attribute the sensitivity on the other person of being asked a question. Like I'm going to
Mhm.
hold back because I don't want to put you in that awkward position, or you might not want to be asked for that level of specificity of
Yeah.
commitment, or you might not already ask why you do something that way. But when the person being asked is the researchers said, they actually said, we actually want to be asked that question.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, because I'm going to be mad at you if you don't give me the report, even though I didn't ask you for a commitment, and
yes,
that's really fair to you.
totally. I think there's another reason why we don't ask as well, which
Okay.
is we don't, in many cases, we don't even realize there's something to ask about because we're not curious.
Yes.
The way that we see the world, we think is just reality.
Mhm.
Of course, it's obvious she knows that it's going to be on her to give me the orange or to do or that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Or of
Yeah.
course, I'm right. Or of course, this is how things work. And we get stuck in these mental loops. I call it in the book the certainty loop, where basically
Yeah.
the way that all the assumptions we bring to the situation color how we look at the situation. We reach conclusions that just reinforce our assumptions, and we
Yeah.
walk around in the world kind of just certain about how it goes and how it is, and that kills curiosity. And
Yeah.
so when we have that level of certainty, there's nothing to ask a question about in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. Anytime something seems obvious to you, it's
Yes,
warning bells should be going off in your head.
exactly.
Because what's obvious to you is often not obvious to someone else. In fact,
Yes,
one of the more painful examples of this is the Challenger launch decision, where it was the O-ring that failed, and the engineer who designed the O-ring went home to his wife and said, "We decided to kill 7 astronauts today." And he was interviewed later and he said, anyone with a modicum of common sense knows that rubber doesn't work worth a damn at freezing temperatures. But of course, people didn't know that. If they had, they wouldn't have decided to launch. And so asking, if he could have asked, do you know that rubber doesn't work at freezing temperatures?
yes,
Then if people had said no, the decision not to launch would have been much more obvious, right?
yes. I totally,
Yeah.
yeah, I totally. They were stuck in their certainty that it's going to work. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
One other reason I have found that people don't ask enough is that our repertoire of questions is too narrow.
Mhm.
We have a go-to question, which is good. Sometimes we have questions that are not really questions; they're more like
Yeah.
statements disguised as questions.
Yes.
But there's a whole taxonomy of different kinds of questions that we can use for different situations. Just the same way I think a surgeon might think like I've got my scalpel and all my other tools.
Yeah.
Depending on what I need to do, I've got different tools. That's how questions are too. There's
Yeah.
there's a dozen different strategies that we can use, and no one in life and in school sits us down and says, well, if you actually want to learn this, here's the question to ask. If you want to learn this, here's the question to ask. Once we start to broaden our repertoire, all of a sudden we're able to ask far richer questions and learn far more.
So, what are some good examples from your perspective on good, if you want to get someone's feedback, what are some
Yeah.
good, because one of the things I say in Radical Candor is one of the first things you need to do is develop a good go-to question for soliciting feedback.
Yeah.
But there's no one right way. If I tell you what my question is, that doesn't mean it's a good question for you. Because if you sound like Kim Scott and not like Jeff Wetzler, then people won't believe you want the answer. So, what are some good ways to think about how to ask for
Yeah.
for
The
feedback?
only thing I think that is true of every that makes a good question, in my definition of a quality question, is a question that helps you learn what's important from someone else.
Yeah.
And I'll just give you, one or two examples of quality question strategies. One of the most overlooked quality question strategies is what I call request reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is when I'm giving someone direction or explaining something or giving guidance. Once I'm done, I just ask a question after that. So what's your reaction to that? How did
Yeah.
that land with you? How does that strike you? What does that make you think? What might I be overlooking? Any number of those, phrases is an example of the strategy of request reactions. And I think far too often we assume that once we give someone input or guidance, if they disagree, they're going to tell us. But for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that people may not feel safe doing that, they don't. I'll tell you one short story. When I was a new manager and someone had just taught me this question, I was thinking, well, let me try out what I was just trained on. So I was working with one of my direct reports. I just given him a bunch of guidance and input and direction. I thought we were good. And then I said, all right, let me just try out this question. So I said, what's your reaction to what I just said? And he paused for a minute and he said, I mean, honestly, if you really want to know, it's totally demoralizing to me. I do not think this is the direction we should go in.
Wow.
And had I not asked him that question, I would have walked away thinking, we're
good. Yeah.
And he would have walked away thinking, Jeff is totally out to lunch. And by him telling me that, and then I can say, well, how come? And then we unpacked it. And what we discovered is that we each just had different information and assumptions that we were working on about what needed to happen in the project. We could clear those up, and then it was good. And it just saved us weeks and weeks of time that we would have diverged. So that's one example of a quality question strategy.
That's such a great example. What it reminds. I got some feedback at one point, so I tended to I'd say blah 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 blah. I give somebody direction or whatever, and then I'd say, "Does that make sense?"
Right.
And people are like, "That's a terrible question because it sounds like you're asking me if I understood."
If I'm smart enough to have made sense of what you just said.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so what's your reaction is a much better way to ask that question.
Yeah.
There's something that Jim Morgan, who was for many years the CEO of Applied Materials, said. He said, let me see, I'm going to get it wrong, so correct me if I do. He said, good news is no news. No news is bad news, and bad news is good news. The point here is that if somebody tells you bad news, that's actually good news.
Yes.
And learning how to respond to bad news or to criticism with some excitement that you're learning what they think, I think is a good way to prompt yourself to ask. Whereas if somebody comes and gives you good news, you need to realize that you haven't learned anything. That's just sort of the fog of flattery coming at you.
One of the things that I learned in my first job, which was in management consulting at a place called Monitor Group, is to explicitly invite critical feedback.
Yes.
So, so if someone says, I think you did a great job, well, first of all, you can say, well, what did you like about it? Because that actually helps you get more specific.
Push them to be more specific, yeah.
But then to say, and what could I have done better?
Yeah.
And I will tell you, as a manager, I am guilty of ruinous empathy sometimes just because I'm running from thing to thing. Like I'm in a meeting with one of my teammates. I see something they could have done better.
You notice something.
I notice it registers with me. And then the meeting's over and I'm running to my next meeting. And then the next thing happens, they don't get the feedback. But I say to them, if you say to me, Jeff, what could I have done better in that meeting? I promise you, I will pause and give it to you. But you may need to say that to me. You may need to prompt me to do it because I don't mean to not invest in you. I'm just rushing to the next thing, but you can get it out of me if you pause and just ask me that question.
There was somebody I was coaching who said to me that one of his direct reports came and said, "You always seem so busy, so I don't dare approach you and ask." And so he had to learn to seem more relaxed so that people would prompt him and ask him.
Just to comment on that, back to your question or your point about ruinous empathy, and my question about how are we complicit in the ruinous empathy. I actually think one way that we're complicit in ruinous empathy is seeming so busy that people don't actually so that's another way that we invite people to have ruinous empathy with us. And your other point about if someone gives you bad news and you react defensively, that's another way that we're complicit in ruinous empathy as well.
Totally. What's a better question to ask than does that make sense when you are sharing personally about yourself and you want to check and make sure the other person understands what you are saying? So I think that rather than saying, does that make sense? Say one idea, and Jeff, you're the expert on how to ask, but here's my idea. You can improve upon it. Is just asking the person, what do you think? How would you feel in my shoes, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
What
love
do you
that.
think about that question?
I like that question, and I'll add some additional alternatives. Um, in addition to what's your reaction to what I just said? You could say, how did that land with you? How did that strike you? What did that make you think
Yeah.
or feel when I shared that with you? Um, and then and I see in Claire's question specifically, you want to make sure the other person understands what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think some of the questions both that Kim and I pose can give you a clue as to whether they understand what you're saying, because based on how they respond, you can know, did they grasp what I'm saying? But sometimes I think it can also be appropriate to say, I just want to check if I'm communicating clearly. Can you tell me back? What did you hear from me? What did you take away from what I just said?
Yeah.
Because I want to see if I'm expressing myself.
Yeah.
What's coming up for you is another one. I like that,
Yeah,
Jason.
that's a good one. And
Yeah.
I think asking the person to repeat it back to you is really a great idea. You also have to be, though, very careful that that doesn't come across as patronizing.
Absolutely.
I've tried that sometimes, and it's worth practicing doing that.
And I think one of the ways you can avoid it sounding patronizing is communicating your intention behind why you're doing that.
Yeah.
And the intention not to say, I want to see if you got it, but to sort of say, I'm actually not sure if I'm expressing myself clearly enough. And if you do that sincerely, that can be a way to reduce the sense of patronizing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm being clear is very different than saying, I'm not sure I'm being clear. Can you help me?
Yes.
It's very different from saying, you're not listening to me.
Yeah, I want to check if you got it. Right.
Yeah, yeah. I want to check that I was clear. I think it's important to make sure that you own your part of the communication, and not that you're putting the burden of communication on, did the other person listen well enough, but did you say it well enough? Yeah. What am I missing is a good one.
I think that's one of the most important questions. What am I missing?
Yeah.
And also, it's a good question, by the way, to help us get curious ourselves. I did this fun experiment with, just as a slight diversion, with AI, where I wanted to see if AI could help me get more curious. And
Oh,
so
good.
I put into AI all of my righteous opinions about a political candidate and how could someone ever vote for this person and what would they be thinking. And then I wrote at the end to AI, what might I be missing? And then I hit enter. And all of a sudden, I got back all kinds of interesting considerations that I hadn't thought about. Here's why someone might like that person. Here's what you might not be thinking about. And I did the same thing. I have this major dispute with my business colleague, and they're totally wrong. What might I be missing? And what I love about that question and doing it in the context of the privacy of AI is it's not embarrassing. I can just sit there and think about it, but it loosens the grip of the certainty of my story on myself.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's interesting about curiosity and emotion, because one of the things that I recommend is sometimes when I give someone feedback, they might respond with anger.
Yes.
And I've tried to train myself when that happens, because it's instinctive if somebody's yelling at me to get mad back and start yelling back. And that's usually not going to solve the problem, or to sort of clam up into a self-protective, what I call manipulative insincerity. And so one of the things I've tried to do when someone is yelling at me is to get curious, not furious, back. And to start to ask myself, and then to ask them, well, what did I do that contributed to this anger? Or maybe their anger has nothing to do with me, actually, but why are they so angry? And how can I help resolve the situation? So I think curiosity can be really helpful to move a conversation away from obnoxious aggression and towards radical candor.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you and I were talking about these ideas, and you gave me such helpful input for the book as along the writing process, I think you taught me that phrase, when they're furious, get curious.
Yes.
And we also talked about, and I write about it in the book, when you're furious, get curious as well.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
in the book I talk about curiosity killers, and the number one curiosity killer is emotional hijacking. When our own emotions get hijacked, our curiosity just completely shuts down. But if we can use our emotions, if we can get a tiny bit of space and notice, hey, I'm furious, that's my cue to get curious. Hey, I'm really upset. That's my cue to get curious. Almost the same way that I think sometimes people would leave a rubber band on the doorknob to remind you to start the dishwasher, or whatever else. Can we use our emotions as that rubber band to say, I'm noticing that. Okay, that's my cue to ask, what can I learn here? What can I learn from this person? And that starts to push away some of the other thoughts.
And I think that investigating emotions is so important because when we communicate with each other, we communicate on an intellectual plane and on an emotional plane at the same time. And if we ignore the emotional signals that the other person is sending us, if we like back away from them and shut down in the face of them, then we're never going to communicate very well. So using those emotional cues as a way to improve communication, I think is really important.
I totally agree. In fact, you're kind of anticipating step 4 of the ask approach, which is called listen to learn. Once we've asked the question of someone, then how do we listen back? And I draw from this theory by someone named David Candor, who was a family systems therapist, who said that people speak in 3 languages. They speak in the language of the content of what they're saying. They speak in the he called that meaning. They speak in the language of the emotion that they're expressing and displaying. And then they also speak in the language of action. What's the action that they're taking in the conversation?
Yeah.
And so if I can be listening for, what are the facts and arguments? What are the emotions? But also what's someone doing? Are they going along? Are they pushing back? Are they delaying? Are they taking side? And you can then start to look at, is there congruence between the words and the emotions and the actions? Is there dissonance? Almost the same way that someone, like a music aficionado, I think would listen for the percussion and the vocals and the harmony and get really good at each one. And then when we can start to put that back together, we just get so much more information when we're listening to someone.
I love that. That's so helpful. And what is it about AI which doesn't have any emotion that makes it so helpful? Like Jason Miller said, it's a great use of AI. So somehow when you ask AI, what am I missing? It's less likely to get emotional, and therefore you're less likely to get emotional. So it can be very helpful on that, on the intellectual of those two systems side.
I think for me, I love that question. Why is it more helpful? To me, for me, part of it is I don't feel judged by AI because I can vomit all of my righteous judgments into there, then say, what am I missing? And they can say things back. And I'm not thinking they must think I'm a jerk for thinking all these things. It's just a machine.
Yes.
Incidentally, you could also use AI to generate questions to ask the other person. Like I've also said to AI, here's a situation. I'm really stuck here, whatever. What are some questions that I can ask the other person? And when I've done that, including even in my marriage, I get questions that I never thought of asking my wife before.
That's amazing.
From AI. And maybe they're not all great questions, but if I get 10 questions and there's like 6 of them and 3 I hadn't thought of, those 3 can open up. So
that's amazing.
It's been really interesting.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Okay. So let's go through the steps. We got to 4. So review the first 4.
I'll just walk through them. Yeah.
Let's walk through them.
The first one is the root of everything, which is called choose curiosity.
Yes.
And I'm positing here that curiosity is not just a trait that some people have and other people don't have. It's not a state of mind that we happen to be in. It is a choice. It's a decision that is always available to us. And when we choose curiosity, we are essentially centering in our minds one question, which is the question of what can I learn from this person? And when that's the question, it pushes out all the other questions like how can I show them smart or how can I get them to do what I want, whatever. And so that's the foundation. That's number 1.
Can we just double click on that for a minute?
Yeah,
I think it's such an important point because even if you disagree with the other person and you're not going to get to agreement, you can still learn something from that person. And then the conversation is worth something to you. And so when your goal is to learn something from the other person as opposed to change their mind, you're much more likely to have a conversation that even if you don't wind up agreeing will help you build a better relationship.
And oftentimes you also find more common ground than you realize. But even if it's a conversation where I'm here to give somebody else feedback, I can still go in with the intention of what can I learn from them? Because if I think they screwed up, what I want to learn is how come, and how did I contribute to it? And so there's always something to learn to be curious about.
Yes.
So that's number 1.
Yeah, and also recognizing that omniscience is never present and never required.
Exactly. We all only see part of the story.
Yeah.
And so if we're in a situation with someone else, there's always a way that they're seeing it that we don't know. And even if that's all that we learn, that's really important to learn too. And it's fascinating.
Yeah.
As well.
All right. So that's number 1.
That's
number 2.
Number 2 basically says, even if I'm curious to learn from you, Kim, if you don't feel safe telling me your truth, especially if it's a hard truth, I'm not going to learn from you. So number 2 is called make it safe. And it draws a lot on the research on psychological safety, pioneered by Amy Edmondson and others. And it's basically about letting the other person know, first of all, why I'm asking the question. Because, and we talked about this earlier, if they have to guess at our agenda, chances are they're going to guess the wrong thing, or they're going to guess the worst possible motives that we have.
Yeah.
So it's about saying to the other person, I'm actually stuck. I'm not sure I'm communicating clearly. I'm not
Yeah.
sure why we're having this situation. I need your help. And especially if we can open up in ways that make that demonstrate some vulnerability on our own part, that invites that reciprocity. But part of the other part of making it safe is what I call radiating resilience. And I think this is one of the biggest ways to defend against someone treating us with ruinous empathy, which is to demonstrate to the other person, I can handle your truth.
Yeah.
I'm not going to crumble. I'm not going to get you back. If I have an emotional reaction, I'm going to own it and take responsibility for it. I'm not going to blame you for it. It could be as simple as saying to the other person, listen, if I were in your shoes, I might be feeling really frustrated with me right now. And if that's the case, I would totally understand. I'd love to hear more about that. But when you put that out there on the table, it makes it so much easier for the other person to trust that I can handle what you're going to tell me.
And I think that is really important, because that, if we go back to ruinous empathy, like if I'm not sure you can handle then I'm not going to answer your question. And,
right. I'm going to give you the most gentle answer, not the real answer.
Yeah. And I think also reassuring that other person that not only will you not crumble, but that you will reward them for the answer. Even if you disagree with the answer, you will still reward them.
There's something in it for them to be,
and
with you too.
Because they're taking a risk to answer your question.
Exactly.
And if we all know, if you don't reward risk, the person's not going to take the risk the next time.
I'll just mention one other part of making it safe that I found really interesting in the research for the book, which is even the time and place and space of where we connect makes a difference. So for the book, I interviewed some iconic CEOs of organizations like Kraft and Medtronic and so on. And CEOs are notorious for not getting the truth. They're insulated from the truth because people tell them what they think the CEO wants to hear. And so I said to them, how did you get the truth out of people? Especially people who are like multiple layers away. And one of the themes that I heard, they said, like, if I want to get the truth from someone, I'm never going to invite them into my office, make them sit across the big, intimidating CEO desk from me, and assume they're going to feel safe to tell me the truth. I'm going to go to where they're comfortable. We're going to go eat where they want to eat. We're going to go on a sales call, ride along together. We're going to take a walk. And there was no single answer as to what where the right place to do it is, other than wherever the other person feels more comfortable, not where you feel more comfortable. And
you got to lay your power down. If you
got to lay your power down, right? Flatten the hierarchy.
Yeah.
I found this even with my own daughter. You mentioned that you have teenagers as well, but I don't know about you, but when my daughter comes home from school or at dinner and I want to ask her questions and find out what's going on, and I say, "What did you learn today? And how was it?" I get completely stonewalled. I get absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
But if I go where it's safe for her, which means I have to stay up till 11 o'clock at night when she's done with her homework, done talking to her friends, I go hang out in her room. She doesn't want me to leave. It all just comes out and out and out.
Yes.
I'm completely exhausted. I wish I was in bed. But if I want to learn, I got to go where it's safe for her.
Exactly. My son has a beanbag chair in his room, and I wait till he's done. He's taken his shower and he's and then I go sit there and talk.
Exactly. So all of that is number 2. Make it safe.
Okay. Make it safe, and maybe even go beyond making it safe, rewarding it,
I love that.
Yeah. Okay. So curiosity, safety. Now
then
what's
number
next?
3 is called pose quality questions. And so this is what we were talking about earlier. And I distinguish between crummy questions and quality questions. Crummy questions are questions, some of them are clumsy. Like, if you ask 2 or 3 questions in a row, the person doesn't know which one they should respond to. Or one of my favorite clumsy questions is when someone says something and then says, "Isn't that right?" And I think they genuinely want to know, do you agree with them? But when they say, "Isn't that right?" it's very hard to disagree. It's kind of like what you said. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But there's also sneaky questions where people are trying to kind of manipulate you into the answer by saying, wouldn't it be better if we did this? And don't you think, those are sneaky questions. There's also attack questions. So there's all kinds of questions that are clumsy. And quality questions are the questions that really tap into what someone knows, thinks, and feels. They include things like request reactions, but they also include questions like, how do I hear their headline? Because people don't always tell us the headline of what they think. How do I dig deeper to really understand where that comes from? How do I see what they see so I can actually understand the experience that they've had? All of that. So those are examples of quality questions.
Jason has a question. I wonder if there's a way to do that virtually. And I assume, Jason, you're talking about asking these quality questions virtually, but feel free to offer follow-up. So what's the best way to ask these kinds of questions if you're not in person?
Well, I want to just point out one thing that you just did, Kim, that I think is a quality question in and of itself, which is that when Jason said, I wonder if there's a way to do that virtually, that could be interpreted in multiple different ways. We don't know what that is.
Yes.
And one of the quality question strategies that I talk about in the book is simply called clear up confusion, which is just to say, tell me what you mean by that term. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Or here's my assumption.
Here's my assumption. Is that right? Or did you mean this or this? There's many different ways to do that.
The safety part. Okay.
Jason
he answered the question.
So it's the safety part.
In
my
how
experience,
how do you make it safe over Zoom?
I actually think it's even more important to do it virtually because we don't have that extra context for people. And so even questions like, with the where and when and how, thanks, Jason, the where and when and how to do it, you can give people a choice. You want to do it over, video? You want to do a phone call? Sometimes a phone call is safer to people. When do you want to actually do it? When's going to be easier for you to do it? And then whenever you do it, the step of opening up and saying, here's why I'm asking, and here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I need. You can do that whether you're in person or virtually as well with the other person. You can radiate resilience in person or virtually. So I do think it can take some extra effort because we don't have all the 360-degree cues that we get when we're in person. But that effort is extra important when we're virtual. It's also, by the way, I should have said, extra important when we're working across any kind of line of difference. Whether there's power differences, racial differences, gender differences, other identity markers, all of those things raise the stakes on psychological safety. And so it means we need to lean into that step even more.
I think also virtually, I would recommend actually a phone over a video call. In fact, I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, but there's, we talked about it a little bit. There's this evidence that we misinterpret facial expression and body language. So we assume, like, if I look like I am sad, you might assume that I'm sad. But actually, if I'm tearing up, odds are it's because I'm furious, not because I'm sad, Right. And you might be able to better figure out what's going on for me if you just listen to what I'm saying rather than noticing.
I have that experience when I have a coach, and whenever I do a coaching call with my coach, I prefer to do it over the phone because I feel like we could just be with each other in a totally different way. The other advantage of the phone is that I'm not watching emails come in and texts come in and all the other distractions. As well.
Nobody is as good as they ought to be at shutting down all the notifications.
Yeah, but I would say, especially if you have any formal power in the situation, ask the other person which way do they prefer to do it. Sometimes some people may want the video, some people may want the phone, some people may want to actually text for a little while. Who knows what it is?
Yeah,
give them the chance to guide you.
The other thing that's interesting about creating a safe environment for soliciting and getting answers to your questions is that there's a lot of evidence that shows that people who are underrepresented feel safer remotely than in person. And I think that's important to pay attention to. And it's also true that people who are underrepresented, I don't know if it's true. There's data that shows, who knows what the truth is. But there's data that shows that people who are underrepresented actually experience more bias, prejudice, and bullying online than they do in person. And it's interesting to think about how unsafe they must feel in person for them to prefer this hybrid environment. So
when the world first went on to Zoom during the pandemic, there were times when people kept their video off. And my initial reaction was, how dare they? Like, I want to see them just so they can see me and all that kind of thing. But I actually learned to say, like, if that's actually the space that people are more comfortable in, I need to adjust in certain situations, not in every situation, but in certain situations. It's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we got to 3. Let's 4 and 5.
Number 4 is called listen to learn. So once we ask the question, it all comes down to how well we listen. We talked about how can we triple what we listen for by listening, not just for the content, but also the emotion and also the action. And inside number 4 is strategies for how to do that. And I'll just share maybe one favorite strategy for how to do that, which is what I call pull the thread. So when we ask a question and someone says something, pulling the thread is just say a little more about that. Can you say, what else? Can you tell me more? Because oftentimes the first thing that they say, or even the second thing they say, may not be the real answer or the most important answer. I interviewed for the book Professional Listeners in the Form of a Psychotherapist. they talk about this thing called the doorknob moment, where it's like they're in a therapy session and just as the session's about to end, their client's about to walk out the door, they have their hand on the doorknob. That's when they say, I'm thinking about leaving my spouse. That's when they say, I'm getting investigated for this or whatever. And it's like, why didn't they say that the whole time? Well, maybe they were building up the courage. Maybe they didn't have that. So we can't just take the first thing they say and assume it. We've got to encourage more. And of course, once they say that's all there is, then we can respect that boundary. So that's one important listening strategy. And there's others in that chapter as well.
Yeah, a follow-up question is always a good way to make sure that you are because we often, even though we just asked, when we get the response, we often jump to conclusions about the response.
Totally. We even jump to conclusions about whether we understood what they were saying.
Yes.
And then do you want to go to number 5?
Yeah, let's go to number 5.
Number 5, you helped me with, Kim. I don't know if you remember this or not. So number 5 is called Reflect and Reconnect. And this is really about where, once we've listened and heard what someone has to say, reflection is how we make meaning of it. How do we actually turn the conversation into insight and turn insight into action? And so I talk about this method called sift it and turn it. And the sift it part, Kim, you and I talked about, which is that not everything that someone says to you is necessary or important for you to take in.
Yeah. You can reject some of the feedback that you get.
Exactly. So the first thing to do in this step is to ask yourself, of all the things they told me, which ones do I want to just let go of? And which ones are important? And sometimes it's helpful to get a couple friends or colleagues to help you do the sifting so that you're not accidentally sifting out something that's important. But they can also help you release things that are not important to stick with.
Yeah.
So then once you've sifted it, then turning it is just to ask yourself a couple questions, a couple of reflective turns. You turn it in your mind. The first is, from what I heard, how does that affect my story about what's going on here? Did I learn something new about the other person, the issue we're dealing with, the decision? The second turn is, and what steps can I take about that? What am I going to do now? And then the third turn is there anything here that has taught me something about my deeper stuff? Maybe my biases, maybe my assumptions, maybe a prejudice that I have, maybe any number of different things. And so just turning it over in our minds 3 times for our story, our steps, and our stuff is the reflective process. And then I call it reflect and reconnect, because it's not enough just to walk away and take the insights for ourselves. That can be extractive. Reconnecting is going back to the other person and saying, this is what I learned from you, and this is what I'm going to do about it. And thank you. And you took a risk, and I appreciate the time. And that does a number of things. First of all, it gives you the chance to let the other person correct your takeaways, because maybe you didn't take away the right things. And you can ask, is there anything different you would have hoped to learn? But it also lets them know they didn't waste their time. That it was worth the risk. And I think it increases the chances they're going to want to share with you over time, because it shows them that you really care, that you really listen.
And also telling them explicitly, like, you told me this, this, and this, and I decided I'm not going to do anything about those things. Like telling them what's the wheat and also what was the chaff. What did you decide to dismiss? Which can be
100%.
hard. It can be hard, but it's better than feeling brushed off.
And I don't think people assume that just because they told you have to do it all. Yeah. But if you can at least say, here's what I'm going to do, and here's why, and here's what I'm not going to do, and here's why, then people at least know that you've listened to them and you've heard them. And I love that follow-up question as well. Tell me more about that, for sure. And it's a good example of something that doesn't necessarily sound like a question, because it sounds like a command. But the intention is that you want to learn from someone, and the intention is what really matters.
I love that. It is a good way to express curiosity. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining. Any last bits of advice for folks? Where can they get your book? Where can they follow up with you? What's the best way, if they want to learn more, for them to do it?
Thank you for inviting me. I love to connect with people on LinkedIn. So Jeff Wetzler, just connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a website called www.askapproach.com. And on the website is something called the Ask Assessment. So you can find out which of these 5 steps are your strengths and which ones do you want to grow in as well. And then the book can be found anywhere that books are sold.
Excellent. All right. Well, Jeff, thank you for writing it. I know that writing is a labor of love. So thank you for doing the work. I know your book is going to help so many people.
Thank you. And thank you for all your contributions to the book as well. It has meant so much to me.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal, with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.